center that was called the Gerontology Research Institute. He was the head of that for quite a long time. And had a kind of distinct organizational identity. And also at a time when what USC Andrus was known for was sort of fighting age stereotyping and disproving commonly held myths of aging. I think in decades since then, we've kind of, with several years more bio-gero focus, we're probably more identified now in some ways with looking at dementia and chronic illness and disease in some ways. And we've lost some of the old fighting the stereotypes view. But certainly, in those days especially, Shai was starting off with the assumption that what society was arguing, and anytime you hear somebody like say this, talk about conventionalism, what society is arguing, you should be aware that there's a straw man or a straw person that's supposed argument being set up that the researcher is going to fight with, and you might want to think about whether you think this is really what society believes. But at least at that time, you felt that society believed that adult development was essentially progressive decline, especially in the intellectual sphere. But the decline was universal in the sense that it happened to everybody. It wasn't specific in particular groups or disorders. And that the decline was inevitable, that there was nothing that could be done about it. You were going to hit a peak early on, and you were going to start the long downhill slide. And you've got, with numbers filled in. This is in Mike Jones or Conrad and some of the articles that you have. These were all based, pretty much all based on cross-sectional data. The peak was usually in young adulthood. I can remember actually being told frequently in my high school and college days, I think like late 60s, early 70s, we were commonly told that how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of neurons we were going to be losing every year now for the rest of our lives. And faculty always smiled. And we thought about how many they had already lost. And it was linked that way. It was a part of this argument. And it's an interesting kind of shift on both sides of the fence that based on autopsy data of older people, well, people of any age at death, and gross anatomy primarily, people observed that old people's brains were smaller than young people's brains. And so we have this very compelling argument that here, like, here's what happens to IQ, and your brain gets smaller every year. So, of course, it has to be inevitable because neurons are pouring out of your ears as you sleep at night. You see it.
Isn't there a sort of prestigious math award that you have to, it's been around for a while because there's no Nobel Prize in math, and you have to apply to it before you turn 40 because the belief is, it's a long-held belief that after 40 your brain's going to decline, so they won't accept your work?
The observation is true. The rationale may have shifted and may have given differently at different times. It's commonly believed in math and in physics and some of the other physical sciences that if you don't make a contribution by the time you're 30, you're not going to. And it's partly argued on the basis that you just said that you're not going to be smart enough for it. But it's also argued on the basis that the technology and the theories change so rapidly that the only time that you're actually going to be up to date is while you're in grad school, and maybe for a couple of years thereafter. But like, once you once you're like 5 years postdoc. You washed up. Yeah, and I mean, whether they're right or not is a different. But this does still happen to people in several occupations. It's not at all uncommon in software programming that people get put out to pasture at about 40, in the belief that you can't keep up with the most modern advances in software. Although it's a totally different system, one where it would be less obvious on the face. I don't mean to insult anybody in those relations. It's less obvious on the face of it that academic intelligence is tied up in this, but script writing in Hollywood is also. People are often put out the pasture at 40.
Would you say that whole culture of all this that we're describing kind of stems from these kinds of...
Historically, it certainly did. And I probably hang out too much with Gero people to have a really good sense of how much we've changed society on this. I think in terms of what I see and hear in the media, to the extent that I pay any attention to that, I think the pervasiveness of this in people's thinking is at least less than it used to be. And that people have gotten a little more up to date anyway about this not being kind of rigidly true and is driven by biology. Probably as much because of partly because actually there was a lot of at least popular science writing about Schei's predictions. Some of the advances in understanding what goes on in the brain with aging, I think, permeated the media. And then I think also the awareness of Alzheimer's and other late life dementias as illnesses rather than normal development has gotten fairly wide attention. So I think it's weakened somewhat, but I think in some domains, clearly it's changes. People are using a different rationale, but still doing the same stuff. You may not say that you're kicking people out at 40 because their brains are smaller, but you say that you're kicking them out at 40 because they're not at the cutting edge of the field anymore, or they don't understand what young people want to see on television.
Would you say that the origin of that whole idea still goes back to publications and ideas like this, or that it was something that was around long before, and this was almost like
It's been around a long time. The idea of the biologically based intellectual decline. What Warner noticed, I think I mentioned before, especially it's a really good idea if you see a lot of diverse results in the literature that you're reviewing for whatever reason, is first of all, it bothered him that while this picture was consistently argued across articles, that depending on who you read, the age at which you peaked could be different. And sometimes it was 18, and sometimes it was 20, sometimes it was 22, sometimes it was as late as 30. He felt like if you have a biologically brain-based phenomenon, you're going to be able to pin down the peak age a little closer than a 12-year span. And then, as he looked at the decline, it also turned out that the steepness of the decline was different in different articles. And then the next step on the way to his discovery was that he lined the articles up by year of publication, and it turned out that the later the article was published, the older the peak of intellectual ability, and the less steep the slope of decline.
Was that because the authors were older? Because they were...
No, most of the authors, some of the authors were gone. And this is you get to wondering, like, why would this happen? And this is how I kind of got to the whole idea of cohort effects. The later in time you were looking at this, the longer people's ascent lasted into adulthood, and the slower the decline was across the remaining years of adulthood. And then, of course, he decided that you really shouldn't call something